Good morning. For most of us, this is another story we know well from our childhood. David and Goliath, the shepherd boy going out to fight the giant. And it seems we have a natural tendency to be on the side of the little man in any unequal contest. How big is a giant? I remember reading to my children the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. They're all older now. Jack also fought a giant, and in one illustration in our reading book, Jack was standing on the palm of the giant's hand. But today, we're not talking about a fairy tale, but about biblical truth. Goliath was about 9 feet tall, or if you prefer, getting on for 3 meters. I met a giant once. I was working abroad at a paper mill. When dismantling some electrical equipment that we were having problems with, I needed a very special spanner. And as we were in a very remote place, I wasn't expecting to find one. And we were hundreds of miles from a good tool shop. As expected, they didn't have the spanner I needed. But instead, they had a member of staff who was over 8 feet high and broad to match. When I explained my problem to him, he reached inside the equipment, grasped the offending item with his hand, and unscrewed it. He was a nice chap, very friendly, but somehow intimidating just by his size. I got a glimpse then of how the Israelite army must have felt when they saw the Philistine enemy had Goliath on their side. Goliath issued a challenge. He suggested that rather than the two armies going to war, King Saul should choose a man to fight Goliath. If Goliath was defeated, the Philistines would become Israel's slaves, although if you read on, the Philistines later welched on the deal. On the other hand, if Goliath won, Israel would become the slave of the Philistines. King Saul would have been mad to agree. King Saul agreed. Now he's got to find his man. Saul offered great rewards. If someone kills Goliath, he can marry my daughter. Not very PC, is it? Wonder what she was like. Was she a good catch? No one stepped forward. If someone kills Goliath, all that man's family were exempt from taxes. Even so, I wouldn't have fought Goliath, would you? Nor, it seems, would anyone else. But if Israel's army didn't have a giant of their own, they had the next best thing. King Saul himself, the Bible tells us, stood head and shoulders above those around him. And leading the army into battle was very much part of a king's job description. Kings of England did that right up to George II at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. Saul didn't volunteer, and no one else dared suggest it. Then along comes David the shepherd. We don't really know how old he was. The Good News Bible says a boy. Many other versions say a young man. David explains to the king that as a shepherd defending his flock, he has on occasion fought a bear and a lion. King Saul still has his doubts, but no one else wants the job. I think Saul knows the battle is lost. He's now trying to save face, trying to make it look as if Israel at least sent out a great warrior. He kits David out in armour, but with the chainmail and the helmet and the sword, it's so heavy David can hardly walk. He takes it all off and just takes his shepherd's sling and 5 smooth stones from the stream. But he's armed with something much more important, the power of God. I wonder whether anyone took bets on the outcome. But David launched one little stone from his sling and he hit Goliath on the forehead and down he went. David took Goliath's own sword and cut off his head. Who fought and conquered Goliath? There's a song in the musical Porgy and Bess with the lines, "Little David was small, but oh my, he fought big Goliath, who lay down and dieth. Little David was small, but oh my." Who fought Goliath? As Christians, we might be inclined to answer instantly, God. But really, it's a partnership, even if a very unequal partnership. Could David have beaten Goliath without God's help? Of course not. Could God have defeated Goliath without David's help? Well, God is omnipotent, all-powerful, Of course he could handle Goliath on his own. But he didn't. For 40 days, Goliath came out morning and evening and issued his challenge, but God kept silent. He didn't act until he found a man who would put his trust in God, a man through whom God could act to display his glorious power. If you've read John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, you'll remember that Christian, the pilgrim, also came across a giant named Giant Despair. That's the same giant that defeated Saul and his armies, not Giant Goliath, Giant Despair, the feeling that it's hopeless. The battle is already lost, so why bother? But David sees through the gloom and despair. We've got God on our side. No matter how big the opposition, one Christian plus God is a majority. We saw despair in our gospel reading this morning. The disciples facing the seemingly unconquerable weather on the Sea of Galilee. Remember, these were not weekend sailors out for a pleasant row. They were experienced fishermen. This was their life until they were called by Jesus. Bad weather on the lake wouldn't be something new to them. If they were frightened, then the storm must have been something quite out of the ordinary. But they had God's Son in the boat with them. Jesus commanded the wind and waves, "Stop!" And they did. As we look at the world, all around us we see problems. But what can we do? Surely some problems are just too big. But still we can act, we can give, we can pray to the God who gave David victory over Goliath and is just as powerful today. If it ever seems to us that the odds are overwhelming, that we will be defeated in the battle, remember David and Goliath. But when we're praying about some great issue, are we ready to be used by God? Ready to be part of God's solution? All-powerful God doesn't need our help, but he wants it. It's the way he has chosen to work. I often refer back to the early chapters of Genesis. God made the heavens and the earth, and it was good. God made man, and God saw all he had made, and it was very good. Very good, but not yet perfect. Mankind's job was to subdue the world. Those who study Hebrew tell us the word means to knock the world into shape. One of the many amazing things about creation is that it's not finished. We have our part to play in the work. Let me tell you about a man named Murdo McInnes. You can tell by the name he's Scottish. He's a Highlander, but he lives now in Ayr. I should probably say lived. If he's still there, he'll be well in his 90s. Murdo was already retired at the time of this story many years ago, and his favourite pastime was gathering a group of children and telling them stories. Historical stories, biblical stories, war stories. Building the pyramids, the discovering of America, the D-Day landings. And he didn't actually say so because he wouldn't tell a lie, but he managed to imply that each of these events he was there. In fact, he had a key part to play in the proceedings. One day, the local Sunday school teacher asked her class, "Who made the world?" One child answered straight away, "Murdo McInnes." Teacher was cross, and she buttonholed Murdo in the market and told him what the child had said. He answered, "Making the world now. I can't claim to have done more than played a very small part in it." Was he right? We are God's partners. To some extent, however limited, the world is what we have made it. Our Lord Jesus is given many names in the Bible, many titles. One of them is Son of David, umpty great-grandson of David, literally. One of our great English hymns, I think it was actually written by a Scotsman, calls him the Lord's anointed, great David's greater son. One thing you see linking these two family stories is that in today's reading, God, working through one man, fought and overcame the giant, and all the people shared in his victory. By his death and resurrection, Jesus Christ fought and overcame the forces of evil, and we are invited to share in his victory.
Little David was small, but oh my, when little David was small, but oh my.